Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, the cost of living crisis, NATO's northward expansion, Netflix takes on its woke staff, and the Wagatha Christie trial. So the economic news just gets grimmer and grimmer by the day. In the UK, inflation has hit 9% on the consumer price index. We're expecting it to reach double digits soon. The Bank of England governor was talking to MPs this week, and he warned of apocalyptic rises in food prices. We know that there's an energy crunch. We're having the worst energy shock since the 1970s. I mean, Tom, this is just getting worse and worse, isn't it?
Yes, and I think one of the things that's incredibly dispiriting about that is that there's this real fatalism as to what we could possibly do in the face of all this. It's understandable on one level because a lot of this is about external shocks, about external events. You can't very well blame Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak for the war in Ukraine or the pandemic. Obviously, the lockdown measures were very punishing, but the whole world essentially pursued those policies. But I think there's also a refusal to reckon with the kind of longer term factors which have led us to this particular place. I mean, you wrote about this on Spike this week, but this storm, this perfect storm, would have been a lot easier to weather if productivity and wages hadn't been stagnating for so long. This energy crisis we find ourselves in, we left ourselves very exposed to because of the fact that we essentially prioritise green virtue signalling over keeping the lights on, over keeping energy cheap and reliable, again, or even to the extent of blocking investment in crucial infrastructure, not allowing fracking in effect, and again letting nuclear just sort of dwindle. And it's only really getting a look in now when it's kind of far too late to really help anything in the near term. And the only thing that you can hope is it's going to be very difficult for people. I think that to the extent that the government can help those most exposed to this, I think they should obviously be duty bound to do so. But at the same time, you can only hope that we're going to have a much bigger reckoning with how we ended up in this situation in the first place. I think the difficulty is that a lot of the inaction, a lot of the risk aversion, a lot of the weddedness to green dogma over basic bread and butter issues of looking after people in your own country, this is shared across the political class. That sense of fatalism, that sense of inaction, you can apportion blame for that everywhere in Westminster. You would hope that a crisis of this scale would shock them out of it. It hasn't really shown any indication of doing so at the moment. But I think that's why the onus is really on the public and on people in politics to kind of politicise this discussion again, to suggest that the government isn't helpless in the face of these issues, and that we need to start having a proper conversation about addressing the decay in the system, if you like. And although it might not help us, and it might not help households in the months ahead, it will certainly help fortify us against the next crisis.
One of the things that's been most shocking has been the kind of complacency, especially in the past few months. I mean, if you take just one factor that's brought us here, like the lockdown, people were quite triumphalist about the fact that the furlough schemes and the business support schemes had tided us through, and they had to a certain extent. But it was believed that we'd almost got away with it. That there was this very strange view that almost 18 months of on-off shutdowns of factories, of supply chains, of power plants was not going to have any kind of long-term economic effect. So even recently, you'd have government ministers boasting about this wonderful recovery we were going into. We've got the highest growth in the G7. You'd often hear ministers say, and now it's just blindingly obvious that we are paying the price for that. And that's just one of these areas. So you're right, Tom. I think it's got to shake people out of their complacency. It's got to get people to wake up and really think about what is fundamentally wrong in the economy and where things need to change. Ella?
I think the problem is that the Conservative Party, and indeed the Labour Party, not suggesting it would be better under a Labour government, but the Conservative Party is inherently incapable of meeting that challenge. They are, ideologically not able to think about reshaping the economy in any kind of meaningful way. They keep sort of making these sort of pronouncements that, whether or not they're sort of a symptom of Johnson boosterism and a kind of sort of a fake half, we're all in this together, to use the George Osborne quote, on the one hand, but also then kind of suggesting that they're changing and they're giving a handout to poor people, 200 quid here, 200 quid there. They're not able to think about the big picture. And the lockdown is really important because, sure, no one planned a virus that was going to challenge every country in the entire world. But I've said it before and I'll say it again, Rishi Sunak has been given too much of an easy ride because, yes, he made some good decisions, but on the whole, the government, informed by his economic policy, made some very bad decisions. And it's not just disruption to supply chains, it's also the fact that if you have everything hinging on very precarious systems of, all the sort of talk about just in time and all that sort of stocking issues, then 2 years of disruption is going to have 10 years of a lasting effect. And they could have made different decisions about shutting down society, even things on a smaller level, like keeping people away from work. I mean, again, I've said a million times, say it again, furlough was not a holiday for people, for most people, particularly on lower incomes. It was a 20% pay cut that fundamentally changed the way they lived their lives. But the other thing is, you can't help but get annoyed when they roll out ministers like the safeguarding minister, Rachel McLean, earlier this week, who, or whether it's Theresa Coffey previously said, people just need to earn more money. Rachel McLean came out this week and said, people just need to, people really just need to get better jobs and then they'll have more money. And you think, no shit, Sherlock. Everybody wants a better job and more money. And all the commentators everywhere said, this is disgusting. How dare you? It's almost like victim blaming, all that kind of stuff. But in actual fact, no one said, she's right. People do want better jobs. They would like to work, fewer hours for more money, have a job that isn't just lasting the 0 hours contract of that day, but 10 years, job progression, a proper job, skills, blah, blah, blah. Of course, people want that. The question isn't that they're not going for it. The question is, why isn't the government providing that? Why isn't there the kind of economic upsurge or potential for people to access those kind of resources? And you just can't help but thinking that since the financial crash, which was 14 years ago, we have had nothing but either kind of fluctuating between stagnation and downturn. And someone has to answer for that.
Definitely. And, you're talking about these kind of rows over essentially the kind of usual Punch and Judy politics of you're out of touch, you don't, that, or Labour would take us back to the 1970s, all that kind of rubbish. I mean,
and a lot of it kind of taken quite wildly out of context as well. I mean, even that minister's comment seemed to be kind of, which was kind of talking in the broader context of what we need to do in the longer term is make sure people have these blah, blah, blah. But, people who can hold forth against the spreading of fake news, etc., suddenly leapt on it and were like, well, she's just telling people to do this and do that. It's a bit of a replay of the Lee Anderson thing, but even more excessive, I dare say.
I mean, how do you think that kind of almost the kind of culture war plays into this, Tom? Because there is this sort of fight between, I don't know. You do just get this sense that people are talking about poor people like they're just suffering. The government is being mean to them. They're totally helpless. And where does that lead us? There's
a real lack of seriousness in the discussion, definitely, because I think there's just a willingness to, again, as you say, play into the normal Westminster Punch and Judy show to try and just present it's just these top hat wearing Tories who are fundamentally out of touch. And of course they're out of touch, but everyone in politics is pretty out of touch. I mean, we get away from what are quite fundamental structural issues that have been going on in this country for a very long time. It takes us 50 years to try and fail to build a runway. We are fundamentally, structurally incapable of building enough houses for our own citizens to live in. We have got it into our heads that it's a noble thing to make energy more expensive for the greater good. And I think this particular crisis has been a good lesson in the fact that when energy prices really go up, it's catastrophic across society. There's no winners apart from maybe some of the energy companies who've been having a nice time of it recently. In that kind of scenario, it needs to shake us out of all of that. And so this incredibly old-fashioned discussion that's kind of taken place between suggesting that the Tories are just, again, tin-eared and all the rest of it. Of course they're tin-eared, but still, it's not really getting to grips with the scale of the crisis that we're looking at, because all sides of politics are in one way or another implicated in the fact that that not only is politics wedded to a bunch of very punishing orthodoxies, but also just the system is just generally incapable of delivering for people and has been for a very long time. I know there's been this tendency on the left to say, well, this is what we should have been talking about whilst the Tories were banging on about women's toilets and things like this, which I find is just an attempt to kind of dodge those questions. It's not a serious engagement with the issues that are going on. And to the extent that the culture war, which is serious and is real, and as we've talked about many times, has a real impact on people's standing in society, on services, on women's spaces, etc. It's an important issue to the extent that it does interact with these broader economic questions and the broader question of the public's place in democratic politics. It's been the other side of the culture war who have been constantly demonising ordinary people, who have suggested that you shouldn't listen to them, who treat them as objects rather than subjects, who to the extent to which people on the woke left actually really care or have any engagement with working class people, it is just to treat them as kind of passive victims of, again, sort of Tory meanness. There's no kind of sense of giving them agency and all the rest of it. So to the extent that these two things do interact, it's not the slam dunk that these people think it is when they say that, well, we've been spending too much time talking about the culture war and not enough time talking about the things that matter, that ordinary people have been bought off by this whole discussion. I think, if anything, there's a lot of blame on their side for either distracting us from some of the things that matter or undermining the role of ordinary people in public life more broadly, which has essentially been their project over the course of the past 10 years or more.
Distraction is a good word, though, because it does go both ways, because while I'm all here for slating the Labour Party for not knowing what a woman is, and we've said many times on this podcast, it's not just a silly question. It reveals a fundamental lack of honesty and all the rest of it within that party. But there's only so many times I can listen to Boris Johnson kind of bleat across PMQs at Keir Starmer at any question he's asked, saying, well, you don't know what a woman is. And it's like, well, we know that they're crap. Most of us, that's why they're not in government. And two, that most of the discussion is about why the Labour Party is losing voters left, right and centre. What do you think? You answer the question, not on women, but on the cost of living crisis, on housing. The Conservative Party has sold itself in 2019 as, levelling up and blah, 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 or the party of, not quite of the working class, but, of Brexit, of new opportunity. And then you have, big issue in, for example, housing. And Michael Gove's big idea that he comes out with is not they're going to meet the building targets. No, sorry, we're probably not going to do that. Sorry, but we have got this really exciting idea about holding referendums where, individual citizens in a neighbourhood can decide whether or not they get to build a house or build an extension. And, is that out of touch? Yeah, it's out of touch, but it's something more fundamental, which is that it's not just that they're being timid, it's that they have no interest. And this is why I'm saying that neither the Conservative or Labour Party are ever going to meet any of our needs or aspirations for the economy or anything else. They have no interest in fundamentally changing things. And this is an incredibly depressing picture. I don't know what to say to people, but something's got to give. And whether that's, looking at trends like the Gilets jaunes, something positive like that I think people need to start talking about what's going on. And, Martin Lewis, the sort of economist who's all over the broadcast waves all the time, saying that he's worried about civil unrest, which might be an exaggeration, but I think a little bit of something of people kind of coming out and saying, hang on a minute, my energy bill is going to go up by up to £2,600.
Yeah.
This is not okay. Doing something like that, I think might be on the cards for the future. And if it makes politicians wake up, then so be it.
This housing thing is interesting because it just gets to the heart of how much government policy is just tinkering, especially the whole levelling up agenda. It encompasses everything from, cleaning up graffiti to more money for grassroots football. Yeah. So much of climate policy is about installing things like smart meters and making sure,
which have screwed people over, by the way. I've got one. It's terrible.
just all these like tiny little interferences and nudges in your life rather than addressing what is the fundamental problem. We don't produce enough energy in a reliable and cheap enough way. We don't build enough houses that people want to live in where they live in. And our economy is not producing the high-paying, secure jobs that people deserve. But, will we ever get there? I won't hold my breath.
Just another thing on the whole culture war thing. So I think it is tempting even for people on our side of that argument to kind of suggest, well, reality has kind of come back to bite us now. Maybe we'll stop talking about microaggressions. Maybe this will win the culture war for us, or it will demonstrate that the culture war is kind of just a bunch of nonsense people arguing against about Ben and Jerry's latest press release aimed at Priti Patel or something, rather than talking about what matters. I think it's important to know that the culture war is so important because I think it's the way that you get towards some of the issues that matter as well. You kind of have to win the culture war as a means to sorting out these other issues in some respects, just because of the fact that aside from, again, the kind of the genuine material questions that the culture war often involves, it's also been part and parcel of just the demonization and the dismissal of ordinary people. You see that in the kind of woke discussions. You also see it in the kind of whole Brexit discussion. And one of the heartening things that's happened since Brexit is that it repoliticised a lot of areas of public life, even in relation to the economy to a certain extent. The way in which the Tory party moved and tried in this very incomplete, sloganistic fashion to try and capture a sense of needing to address the economic concerns of working class people, quote unquote, left behind areas, a grating phrase, but nevertheless was getting at something, was a direct consequence of the working class vote in this country backing Brexit in 2016 and then moving towards the Tories in 2017 and then very spectacularly in 2019. That's really what put their concerns on the agenda in a way that hadn't existed previously, having spent many years, but particularly the last couple of years, just being depicted as a bigoted throng who shouldn't really be allowed to have any say over the sway of their own nation. So I see the kind of battle to kind of repoliticize the economy and to win the cultural war, not to dismiss it, as kind of complementary in many respects, because it's about returning ordinary people to the center of political life, really. And that's something which is becoming even more important at a time when we're in these incredibly punishing economic circumstances.
One thing I never want to stop doing is learning about the world. And my go-to favourite place to discover new things is Wondrium. Wondrium is a video subscription service which has content on just about any topic. To give you an example, I've just watched one of Wondrium's latest series called The Triumph of Christianity, and I think you'll love it too. If you've ever wondered about how Christianity developed from an obscure Jewish sect in an outpost of the Roman Empire to spread throughout the West and become the world's dominant religion, then this is the series for you. Over 24 fascinating episodes, The Triumph of Christianity takes you on a journey of discovery. It has episodes on the historical Jesus, the persecutions of early Christians, and the conversion of Emperor Constantine 300 years later, when Christianity finally became the religion of Rome. And you can watch it now on Wondrium. Wondrium is focused on helping us become better versions of ourselves. You can explore audio and video courses on hundreds of topics taught by university professors. You can watch documentaries to help you learn more about the world around you. And you can find video tutorials that teach you new hobbies like photography, cooking, and arts and crafts. All of Wondrium's content is world-class and credible. It's presented by experts who all know their stuff. And it's always ad-free. I want you to sign up for Wondrium today. Wondrium is offering Spiked podcast listeners and viewers a free trial plus 20% off an annual plan. To get this offer, you need to visit our special URL, wondrium.com/spiked. Again, that's wondrium.com/spiked. Sign up today. Finland and Sweden have applied to join NATO. Now, this would represent a major kind of overturning of European security architecture. It would be the biggest NATO expansion in decades, and it would expand NATO's border with Russia by double, essentially. Tom, this is a kind of world historical event, another consequence of the war in Ukraine. What have you made of it?
Well, it's hard to overstate significance. I mean, as many people have pointed out, these are two historically non-aligned countries. Finland, for many, many decades, of course, invaded by the Soviets in 1939, fought them off, but ever since then, out of a kind of sense of pragmatism and concern about kind of Russian reprisals, has maintained this sort of military non-aligned status. Sweden's essentially been non-aligned for best part 200 years.
Yes, I mean, it's the Napoleonic Wars, essentially.
So to this incredible shift, that particular policy lasted 2 world wars and the Cold War, and yet now things are shifting. Obviously, you had the inevitable response from Russia, which is to say that there are consequences, but of course, this is the obvious consequence of their own actions. I mean, whatever you think of NATO, we've obviously talked about, spent a lot of time discussing it on this show, and the folly of its expansion over many years and its role in at least creating some of the circumstances for the tensions that we've seen boiling over. But at the end of the day, the image of Russia warning about consequences from essentially a defensive move on behalf of 2 countries is really appalling in a situation where they feel like their own offensive moves should have no consequences whatsoever. So they've got to realise that. Although it's interesting to see that after some more bellicose rhetoric, you've had Vladimir Putin kind of suggesting that if there is to be a response, it's going to be a lot more kind of mild than the original sort of statements might have actually been. They're not kind of, former Soviet republics or anything like that. But nevertheless, I think it's a complicated issue, because on the one hand, it's entirely understandable why Sweden and Finland have done this. They're trying to work out what's in their best national interest. Public support, particularly in Finland, has exploded in favour of NATO ascension. I mean, it was around 20% not that long ago, and now it's like 75%. So there's a clear public demand for this. Also, their forces were quite well integrated, or cooperating at least, with NATO for a very long time. It's not as big a jump as it might seem. But there is something depressing about it, insofar as it's the solidifying and of the tensions that exist, of this kind of bifurcation of the world, it's just kind of making all of that formalised now. And that's something which is really regrettable, even as much as we recognise that the spark for it was a completely unjustified and barbarous invasion of Ukraine. You just wish, that it wasn't thus, but you can understand why those countries have taken that move, definitely.
Ella, I mean, it shows us huge kind of, even putting aside the moral, problems of invading Ukraine, but what a huge strategic error this was for Putin, someone who for his entire time in power has complained about NATO expansion, and he has now been the catalyst of a very large NATO expansion.
Yeah, I think it's a complete miscalculation on the one hand of how strong Russia was. And we know that militarily he's underestimated the ability of Ukraine to be able to withstand the invasion and fight back. But also politically, in terms of, even if you take something as superficial as Eurovision Song Contest, which Rob Lyons wrote about this week, as much as that is a kind of pantomime, ridiculous event, and also kind of subtle political messaging that goes on within that, there was a not so subtle political message of Ukraine's win, which, as Rob pointed out, Putin cares about these kind of sporting and cultural events and showing off, and to see essentially the entirety of the competition come behind the country that he is invading, and as he put it, send a very serious two-fingered salute to Russia is again, I think, part of his miscalculation. I don't think he thought that people would rally around behind Ukraine, or indeed that I think he misjudged the sense of importance around sovereignty, which I think maybe a lot of us did, because there was a point in the last few years where it looked like, particularly from Putin's point of view, but also from those of us sort of criticising anti-democratic moves, that sovereignty was dead in the water. And if it had to take, the invasion of Ukraine to wake up people to that significance, well, then that's a shame. But here we are, and sovereignty is a very important issue, and many countries like the UK and others have rallied around them in that way. But I think Tom's right, you can do two things at the same time. And, while it's completely understandable and a sovereign decision for Sweden and Finland to make these moves, and while we might, question or ponder over the fact that they've made it now rather than during World War II with the Nazis, while it's sort of alarming to see, a few weeks ago or even a month ago, we were talking about, the big changes in Germany. It feels like this war is just kind of ripping up everything of the old rule book, which, isn't always a bad thing. But at the same time, you can also say that in the long term, the bifurcation of these kind of conflicts, the solidification of NATO as this good and moral thing that I think lots of commentators in a kind of superficial way talk about it, is a problem. And we don't want to have a future in which you have a very intense, prolonged sort of latent conflict between NATO forces and Russia. There's no sort of sense of how this is going to end, which is understandable when you're in the eye of the storm in the heat of war. But I think that does need to be recognised, and it's you're able to, and it's possible to criticise NATO, at least keep a critical view on the long-term consequences of these moves, while saying, yes, in the immediate sort of sense, who knows what Russia will do? And if I was living in Finland in particular, I'd think, join it.
I mean, they're probably safe just by given the fact of how overstretched Russia's military is at the particular moment. But as you can say, you can still understand it. There's also the danger, which we've seen many expressions of recently, is that the war in Ukraine and the quote unquote rejuvenation of the West and of NATO, etc., being a kind of means through which a very doddery US, perfectly represented by one Joe Biden, trying to kind of burnish and kind of reclaim its sense of vitality on the world stage, its kind of hegemonic position and all the rest of it. And that has consequences too, through using this military alliance, of course, to kind of burnish its kind of power on the world stage also invites consequences, and in terms of the kind of raising of the temperature, which will continue to take place. So again, it's we can lament these things whilst at the same time recognising why sovereign nations have decided to go down this particular path, considering the barbarism that is taking place effectively on their doorstep.
How Woke Won, the brilliant new book by Joanna Williams, is out now. It's all about the woke takeover of our institutions and how we, the public, can fight back. You can order your copy today by going to spiked-online.com/shop. That's spiked-online.com/shop. So, staff at Netflix have been warned that they may have to work on shows and films that they could perceive to be harmful. And if they don't like it, they can leave. Now, this seems like a big moment in the world of Netflix, in the world of kind of woke Hollywood, where a lot of the time sort of woke staffers are indulged. I mean, we had the big protests at Netflix against Dave Chappelle. Tom, what have you made of this? Is this the start of a fight back against wokeness?
I think it's easy to overstate. I think that's fair to say. With one memo that we're talking about, it's interesting that Netflix, in a very partial, not always consistent way, has been consciously pushing back against this and then sometimes backing off. I mean, the Chappelle thing was a good example. So Netflix's CEO, I believe Ted Sarandos, around that time, he kind of made a relatively bold statement by the standards of kind of woke Hollywood to say that we don't believe that Dave Chappelle's comedy contributes to real world harm and that people need to understand that. He later backtracked, obviously suggesting what he'd said was a bit insensitive and blunt and all the rest of it. But then you see this memo again, which is again an attempt to push back at what is obviously a clear problem. There's been a few pieces kind of swirling around talking about how, maybe Hollywood just got too in on the woke bandwagon too much, that it has alienated people, that there is something of a recognition there. I think the problem is that it's a much deeper problem than what the policy of a particular organization is. It's broadly speaking a generational problem. The pool of quote unquote creatives or people who work in the knowledge industries, full stop, as well as the creative industries across Silicon Valley, across Hollywood. They're a particular set of people with a particular set of cultural ideas, with a particular experience in life, who have gone through the same set of Ivy League or top tier institutions. They've been inculcated into this culture, which suggests that words of violence, which suggests the worst thing you could possibly do is upset someone. This is incredibly difficult to unpick. You can't fire all of them, presumably. So that again kind of gets to the grips of what we're looking at. And if it was just Netflix that we were talking about, then that would be one problem. But we've seen this in the publishing industry, we've seen this in Silicon Valley, etc. That's one actually part of the big tech censorship discussion that doesn't always get quite picked up on, is the fact that often when Mark Zuckerberg or formerly Jack Dorsey, whoever it was, who would engage in acts of censorship, it was often because they had acquiesced to their own staff as well as external pressures. There was walkouts, there was people again taking them to task at these little company-wide meetings that they would have. So it's a quite internal problem. But given the fact that this is generational to a certain extent, and given the fact that this is a lot deeper than one organisation, to get so excited about one memo seems to me a little bit short-sighted. Although it is interesting that at least people at the top of these companies are starting to realise that this is harming them in some real way, that their attachment and association with these dogmas,
I mean, think of the publishing industry in particular. That seems to be one of the worst. I mean, we've had Simon & Schuster, people saying they don't want to staff saying they don't want to publish any books from anyone involved in the Trump administration, or Random House Canada staff allegedly crying over publishing Jordan Peterson's book, or not quite in journalism, the New York Times, Barry Weiss, probably one of the mildest. If she is a contrarian, she's the mildest one out there, being forced out essentially.
Well, in particular, the publishing industry is such an elitist industry. I mean, really, you don't get in there unless you either know someone. You might have a few token kind of pick a CV out of a pile to make sure that we don't get in trouble with diversity officers. But it really is about who you know and what schools you've gone to, and whether you tick the right upper middle class boxes. And so they're kind of I think it's no surprise then that the people within this publishing industry who are either, whether it's at Hachette or Penguin or that pretty much everywhere has had some kind of staff walkout or complaint about a writer. 9 times out of 10, it will be, either conservative or right-wing writer or someone who's talking about something anti-woke. It's not like they're publishing Mein Kampf or anything. It's just kind of stuff on the political controversy. It's a real degradation of the sense of what workers' rights or industrial action or anything that is really about. Because this isn't saying I'm unsafe in my workplace because you're making me work in a basement and there's no running water. It's about saying this book that I have to read, and with my cushy job, which is just about reading lots of interesting books and deciding whether I like them or not, is actually harming my emotional being.
Yeah, I think it's a worker's right not to be offended.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And you think, do a night shift in Tesco and that might hurt your emotional well-being. I mean, Jesus Christ, there's a real sense of, there's a sort of unworldliness about it. But also, it's really unfair for the reading public who don't have any power in this, who might want to read all different kinds of books, by the way, because you see some of these books when they break through go on to become bestsellers. For example, people are still reading Harry Potter, despite the fact that everyone has almost, if they haven't yet, is on the brink of excommunicating J.K. Rowling. And we're being shut out by this very elitist industry, whether it be in Hollywood or in publishing. And the whole thing about creatives, to use, that word that's been completely bastardized, is it's meant to be about pushing boundaries and thinking outside of the box. They're meant to be the great minds that can think of innovative things that we lowly plebs can't think of. But it doesn't seem like that because they're so narrow-minded and, as Tom says, so stuck in their own very particular worldview. And not very many exciting things come out of Ivy League sort of industries like that unless they think about something other than themselves, and they seem incapable of doing that.
You still get the sensitivity reader before the book comes out, and the trigger warning once the TV show comes out, and every aspect of it seems to be curtailed in some way.
No, and I really agree with the point about to frame this as an issue of workers' rights is sort of ridiculous. Not least because of the fact that while some people might shout the loudest, and obviously these people are very overrepresented in these particular industries, if you're the member of staff who dissents from this orthodoxy, you're going to keep your mouth shut. If you're a smaller author or a creator in Netflix or whatever, you're not going to have a very good time if it's made very clear to you that there are certain things you're allowed to say, certain things that will get you a contract, and certain things that will basically make you persona non grata. And even, as you're saying, Ella, it's an incredibly upper middle class industry. To the extent they're concerned about that, they just might have an attempt, as you say, to make themselves superficially diverse, but that won't necessarily change the kind of class composition of what they are. But that's a fundamental barrier as well, because their outlook is fundamentally influenced as well by their sort of class background, by their educational experience. Even if they had some sort of scheme to bring, more working class people into those industries, they would have to keep their mouths shut unless they perfectly mirrored the values of that particular section of society.
Or publish books like Shuggy Bain, where it's like, oh, come in and tell us about how awful your life is and how shit your experience is, and then go away and shut up.
Or Jack Monroe cookbook.
No, exactly. That's exactly it. You're either allowed in because you just so happen to have, you might be from a working class background, but you've ended up at Oxbridge anyway, and you have taken on those particular values. Or because, you just sort of ordered in to do a kind of Angela's Ashes sort of routine to make everyone feel guilty for 5 minutes. So all of this is downstream from that, I think, in so many respects. So much of the culture war is downstream from that kind of clear kind of like class and values division. And I think at Netflix, as much as anywhere else, you're starting to see them start to reckon with that. But again, I've just come back to that point of this is a long time in the making. It doesn't just extend over the course of the past 5 years. These ideas didn't come out of nowhere. We at Spike's been writing about them for a very long time. And that's the much trickier thing to get to grips with. You've got a lot of kind of Gen X liberals who are wondering where the hell did all this come from, when it was quite clear that this has been building for 20, 30 more years,
So the trial of the century is wrapping up. Lawyers have given their closing statements this week in the so-called Wagatha Christie case. Ella, do you want to explain quickly what this case is all about?
It doesn't take too long to explain, luckily. two wags, that's wife and girlfriends of footballers, Colleen Rooney and Rebecca Vardy, are in a spat because Colleen Rooney suspected a number of years ago that someone was leaking stories that were personal to her to the press. She did a little bit of sleuthing on Instagram and revealed that she thought that the person who was snitching on her and selling stories to the papers was Rebecca Vardy. And she did it. The name Wagatha Christie came from her reveal, which she did, it's ... Rebecca Vardy, and the world went mad. And so Vardy has now taken her to court on libel charges. And in what has been sort of days and weeks of spectacle and ridiculous evidence of bitchy text messages and, you know, quite good one-liners, actually, as it happens on both parts, on both women's parts, it looks like, you know, who knows what will actually be ruled on, but it looks like it might have been Rebecca Vardy's assistant who then dropped a phone in the sea in order to withhold it from evidence. And it's ridiculous. Basically, this is a ridiculous libel case. Everybody knows what Spike thinks about libel law. We think it's an affront to free speech, but it's become this kind of spectacle. And in becoming a spectacle, it's produced some rather distasteful reactions to it. So I wrote about for Spike this week, this kind of sneering attitude on behalf of some commentators, one particular article in the Telegraph, which went pretty far on it, describing them as fishwives and saying, you know, it's, you know, disgusting while people are dying and they should be giving money to charities for them to be walking in their lemon boucle suits and trotting around in their heels and wasting money on such a charge. And, you know, you do have to think, well, no one said that about the Depp and Heard, Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, which is essentially about two rich people shitting in each other's beds and getting drunk and being incredibly trashy, in my opinion. And that's treated very seriously. But when it comes to, you know, Rooney, who's, you know, daughter of an Irish bricklayer, and Vardy, who used to be a nightclub promoter, and, you know, they've got particular accents and they, you know, they wear particular clothes and they flash their money. That's really trashy. You know, the whole thing is a ridiculous, you know, it's like the same thing as watching Love Island. There's nothing serious to be said about it.
Yeah.
But I think the people making the most spectacle of themselves are those turning their nose up at those two women.
Tom?
No, it's the chortling has been really insufferable all the way through. Those little key moments, like when, again, you talk about the phone being thrown into the North Sea, and I think it was Colleen Rooney's lawyer saying it was in Davy Jones's locker, and Rebecca Vardy turns around and goes, "Who's Davy Jones?" and everyone cackles and all the rest of it. There's been that really obvious undertone to it. There was, you know, even just suggesting, isn't it ridiculous, essentially, that you've got these two wags, you know, in the Victorian wood-panelled surrounds of the Royal Courts of Justice. It just shows that there's nothing that the commentariat kind of loathe more than working class people with some money. That's just that's been the story of many, many years in this country, and this just being another opportunity for that often hidden prejudice, as you wrote about, Ella, to just slip out into the surface.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.